It's my great pleasure to introduce your next speaker. He's a very insightful thinker and has done extensive digital projects, both with the private sector and the public sector, in over 50 different nations globally. I also want to add that I have a special appreciation for his presence today, because this gentleman devoted literally hundreds and hundreds of hours as chair of our conference committee some years ago for the Pacific Telecommunications Council, and we are all the better for that. So please join me in welcoming the president of Network Dynamics Associates, Mr. Ken Zita.
Good morning. Aloha. It's great to be back at PTC. My first PTC was in 1986, and at that time, I was an industry analyst. I took technology very seriously, like a lot of people that you're hearing from on the panels. And I prided myself as an analyst to be able to return a serve from anybody. So I was like, that's what I did. You can see I still have the same hair as I have now. But you know, things are evolving, right? In the mid-90s, I started doing telecom privatizations and then what we called state building. State building is a little bit different than just selling off a telephone company. And you know, there's some pretty rough times out there, because I was really more like moving from technology to whispering in the ears of leaders, of the czars, the people who actually run governments, and how they think different, to help them think differently. Well, times have changed, right? We're moving into this digital era where things are pretty tricky. But this last picture from me, just from a couple of weeks ago, you can see I lost the beard. And I'm starting to now think about something completely different. Well, if I haven't lost you already on these slides, what's going on is that we're moving into the complexity of digital. It's not telecom anymore. It's really a whole lot harder. And when you look at a shaman, a corporate shaman, a policy shaman, whatever, their main story is trying to help people think differently. And the #1 challenge for governments these days is to think differently about what it means to create a digital economy and a digital future. It's actually quite difficult to get people to change their perspective. So this is really the topic of the session. What can and should governments do to accelerate a digital economy? Now, back in the old days, it's pretty simple. The government owned everything. Then we had privatizations, and lots of money was made with the private sector. A lot of great things have happened because the private sector has been unleashed to develop digital infrastructure. But what we have found is that as we move into digital, we realize that the market isn't working completely. It's what was called the Washington Consensus. Let the market decide, let the market make the investments, and the government should get out of the way. Well, it's not working to achieve the objectives today, and this particularly so in the emerging markets. But what's the #1 message? When you really want to move into this digital future, you've got all these visions, you need to have a foundation that is as deep as your ambition. So today I want to cover 3 topics. Basically, the situation of where governments are at today, emerging market governments principally, as they think about enabling a digital future, what levers they have to work with, and then opportunities for firms, like what can people in this room in this conference do to participate to help with that process. The gap is growing, and it's due to the overall level of digitalization, how innovative policymakers are, or their lack of it, the rise of the hyperscale platforms, the shortage of capital. There's plenty of money around to build a data center in Tokyo or New York, but there's not quite so much in other places in the world. The skills and the business processes, people are still not quite where they need to be in order to enact this digital future. Some people say, in fact, this slide in the background is from Huawei. They say at around 65% level of digital maturity, you start to be able to leverage the impact of AI. So once you hit this trigger point, a transition point, it accelerates even further and faster for the digital leaders. So what does that mean for the people who aren't the digital leaders? Is this fear of missing out. And the fear is real, because as the rest of the world accelerates, that leapfrog into a digital society is actually not so easy, it's getting more complex. So when PTC started 42 years ago, a similar map would show phone penetration around the world. But we can still see now today with online, percentage online, what is what matters to people, that there's still wide discrepancies, which means there's still tremendous opportunities for our satellite businesses, for our network builders and so on. But there's a big, big difference of who is online and who's not. Now let's kick forward a little bit into our data centers story, or cloud story. These are some figures from World Bank, which does a cloud readiness indicator, my colleagues at the World Bank. And just look at the color of the map. Who's ready and who's not? What does that mean? And overall digital readiness is more this notion of a lot more is put in place than just the physical infrastructure. It's not merely about where networks are built, but there's a whole process to enable a transition in the economy. Common goals. There's not a country that I don't go to, and again, I'm often working with the government, often at the cabinet level, that doesn't want exactly the same thing. We want to grow the economy, we want to create jobs for today and for the future, we want universal broadband, we want to modernize our governments, and we want to achieve the development goals, the SDGs. So it doesn't really matter where you go, because people they see the same information. They're reading the same business documents, same business articles. Their president goes to Davos or whatever, and they're all talking the same story. But the question is, how do you make that happen? So governments basically have two big tool sets. The analog enablers, which is the policy, the vision, the storyline, the cheerleading to move capital and to move investment and to persuade investors to do things, and then the digital enablers. Now, a lot of times the digital enablers, meaning the network, the cloud, and so forth, are provided purely by the private sector, but increasingly the government has a role in shaping how and when these investments are made. But these are the two things. Now, from my experience, and I started this talk by saying how much I used to always focus on technology. And the previous panel and the next panel, it's going to be about technology. Technology matters. But my 95-5 rule means that 95% of the most important things are policy related, the soft issues, not the technical infrastructure. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I do it deliberately. And that's because we need to understand just how important it is to get the enabling environment right. So, with the notion that I want to talk a little bit more about policy first, or that environment, what are the challenges? Number one, technology understanding at the policy level. So it's hard enough, for instance, to talk with a minister of telecom or a minister of ICT about transitioning their sector. Getting an engineer, perhaps who went to college and is a spectrum engineer, and now has the unfortunate situation of getting promoted to a cabinet minister, right? And now they have to explain all this digital stuff to everybody else in the cabinet. And you're talking about finance people, you're talking about roads and buildings people, it gets really tricky. So there's really not a lot of understanding at that cabinet board seat. The cost benefits are poorly understood. So I read these reports that say, well, once you get to AI and IoT in this kind of economy, we're going to have trillions of dollars of new wealth. And let's hope so. But today, absolutely nobody really knows that. There's really no good measure of saying that this next step we're at is going to lead to all this wealth. There are no empirical measures. So you're basically asking people on a leap of faith to make significant changes to the way politics are run based on forecasts. An addiction to legacy taxation. There are some countries that tax people up to 50% to use a mobile phone. And I mean, it doesn't do anybody any good. You're squeezing the golden goose and you're taxing the heck out of your growth engine for a digital economy. And it's hard to shift from where the money was to where it should be. High expectations versus local realities, and it's really kind of hard to change. It's not merely that you want to have a digital society. Being specific about it takes a lot of time. I'm a big Buckminster Fuller guy. If you've ever heard of him, he talks about general systems. Very complex systems are hard to change. You push on one side of it, the system pushes back. Anybody who's worked at Verizon or NTT knows what that's like, right? It's really hard to make things new. But the way you can do that, the way you can change a complex system is not by pushing it, but by creating a vacuum. He talks about a trim tab. It's a nautical term of how a rudder moves. You create a vacuum in the right place, and even a very complex system can be encouraged to change. So this is kind of the work that I do. We go into a system, systems analysis of a situation, but then figure out where are the vacuums. How can you make real change that will be lasting? So first thing, you've got to get your plan right. It can't be fluff. It can't just sound good. It has to be whole of government. Everybody needs to buy in. It has to be something that you can deliver on. A lot of plans, they look great, they mean nothing. So how do you actually figure out what you need to do to get all of the resources, public, private, and different departments on the same page? The taxation problem is enormous. Not just taxing mobiles, but look what just happened in India last week. A $13 billion tax bill delivered by the Supreme Court, crushing to the operators in that country. Now, for 2020, what I'm looking at is how we're going to go forward on this digital services tax. It's the big story that's coming forward, and it's under discussion at the OECD right now. But how does trans-border data work? How do cloud services work? How do they get taxed? And so on. In the emerging markets, the spectrum was incredibly expensive. And governments have now reached a point where they realize they can't do this excessive rent-taking. Rent-taking meaning they feel like they own the asset, they can charge what they want. But guess what? The operators are broke. And if you want to move forward on 5G, you can't charge for it. So some governments are starting to think, well, lower the reserve prices or take them out altogether for 5G. Or Malaysia's starting to experiment with some resource pooling. Very interesting. You have to have money. You have to have people who know what's going on. If you have $5 million to spend, you're a national government. Arguably, it might be better to spend that $5 million on a bunch of entrepreneurs than on adding fiber to a secondary city. Can you really stimulate the overall environment where you're going? I don't want to digress in the capital markets, but it's a long-standing issue. There's plenty of money in certain places, but there's not in others. Data localization, decolonization, which is a very politically loaded term, means maybe governments are going to say, well, we're going to control the data going in and out of our countries. And again, from last week, this is in India. There were literally protests in the street when Amazon came in because they say, we want to control how our data is handled. But it's interesting that it's actually becoming a public movement. And then there's 5G. And, and I look at this slide and I'm thinking, what's more surreal? Having the elephant in the conference room, having the geodesic dome in the conference room, or just the absurdity of the geopolitical drama around 5G. And let me just say a couple of things without getting into too much trouble. Security is a reasonable consideration. It's a reasonable concern. The Americans have been ham-handed in the process of trying to limit the spread of 5G. 61 countries have been approached to try to restrict another vendor's technology. 3 have signed on. And from my point of view, just say no is not a sustainable policy for 5G. And what bugs me the most is not what they're saying no to, but what they're not saying that's really important. Because what we should be really talking about as, say, Western democracies is the free flow of information. For 60 years after World War II, this was American foreign policy. We cared about information being universally available everywhere to all participants in all economies. And what we're hearing instead is we're just not going to go that way. And there's a reason for it, and it's because the American security establishment basically controls American policy regarding the information space. I think this is a problem. So where are we today? You have a couple of choices. An information state based on surveillance, which is kind of the model the Chinese are using. Where you are, what you say, the Americans, who you are, what you buy, and then say this other thing called a social compact. And there's a bit of a dig here on the European Union because they don't really know what they want to do. And it really comes down to, can we work with the cloud in a socially responsible way? On reflection, I should have added the Japanese model here, because the Vision 2020 is really a social compact, an effort to try to use the latest technologies to help the society. So there was a very interesting report that came out last year by Freedom House. You may know about it. They tracked a number of variables, about 25, all the countries in the world according to access, content, and user rights. I abstracted that data just to have a look at what it means. And this is just indicative of these 25 indicators. And you can see where Germany is, user rights and content, and then the Americans. You get an idea kind of that we're all making this progress. And you look at India, and it's like, whoa, it starts to shrink a little bit. Those soft factors, those analog factors are not quite as flexible, and there's some restrictions. But then you look at China, and it's astonishing how different China is from the rest of the world. I'm not passing judgment, but it's just noticeable. It's also noticeable that the public mouthpiece says that shutting down the internet is an okay thing to do. The real irony here is that the real abuser of shutting down the internet is India, which has shut down the internet by far more than any other country in the world, and they're a democracy. So it's not necessarily clear-cut of how these different models are playing out. The Splinter Net. I've been using this term for a while. We already know that there are whole zones of the internet that are branching off. We have a great wall around one country. We have another country that's running tests to completely disengage. I believe that we're just at the very early stages of this fragmentation of the net. And I think about, okay, if you look at the complexity of software-defined networking or virtual RANs for 5G, right? All these pieces and who owns what and how the interconnections are going to work and neutral hosts and all this fragmentation of the layers of logic that go with 5G in the future of the internet. I think that complexity pales in comparison to what we're going to see when the internet domain space itself fragments. Now, we're already talking about these, in the United States anyway, these fake news and separate news bubbles, depending on where you're getting your information. Well, that same type of parallel will apply actually on the access network, the backhaul network, and different whole economic, political realms. More cheerfully, governments realize that interventions are required. So again, we talked about the Washington consensus, this idea, you just let the market do what it wants. But we have governments, for instance, let's take the Philippines. We've had a duopoly. There are two major telecom operators. And the operators told the government how it was going to go. It wasn't the other way around. The government wasn't really directing things, because there was so much market power with the incumbents and so little leverage that the government had. And it took them years and years and years to break that duopoly to create another situation. Well, why do they want to do it? It's because there's still people underserved. There's still a lot of people with no digital skills, and the internet is still slow finding its way out. So they want to get in and make some interventions. Accelerating investment, how do you do it? Well, one way is through PPPs, or public-private partnerships. So there's always been tools available to governments like competition policy. You can choose to have more people. You can change the price structure for the spectrum, or who's entitled to have spectrum. When we go into 5G, how many different types of entities will be allowed to be service providers? Won't necessarily just be you telecom operators anymore, because there's a lot more room to change. So there are things that are possible that the government can do that are strictly policy, but principally, you need money for them. So where are the opportunities for the government leading a direction, but also making it possible for the private sector to participate? So I'm going to just highlight a couple of ideas that I think from a PTC audience perspective are where the PPP or engagement with governments are likely to be most fruitful. And the first three are the ones that matter most, as far as I can tell. But international connectivity is still a story. Now, if you're as lucky as the Philippines to be gifted high-speed cables from that country to the United States, 2 terabyte cable, basically donated by Google and Facebook, that's the best way to get investment, right? Free is good. But there's still also plenty of other opportunities, either on the cable capacity, but also to encourage the satellite providers to come in and do the rural and thin route type plays. The national broadband network and domestic backhaul. So again, if you think how investment and how infrastructure has evolved the last 15 or 20 years, it's been strictly done by the telcos, right? They put in fiber to connect their switches in the radio towers and so forth. But it stops with them. They become parochial networks just for the private concerns. And the government is saying, well, we want smaller towns, secondary towns, to get connected. So there are a number of models to allow and engage private sector participation. I'm sorry I missed the last panel because I wasn't back, but this is the sort of thing IFC gets involved with and so on. Government data centers, consolidating the cloud excellence, migrating businesses off of legacy systems. This is a huge play right now. Edges up, shared services. How do you actually deploy, modernize a government operation by getting into a shared framework? And muni fiber and wireless. So there's still, in the United States and Western Europe, fiber densification is well advanced. There are a lot of reasons for it. Enterprises need fiber connectivity, data centers need connectivity. But again, in emerging markets, it's still it hasn't really branched out from the core infrastructure of the telecom carriers. Now, I see a lot of different types of investments, so it's not just on the network side, but also, we'll call them major platforms. And I don't want to digress on this, but this is getting into things like the smart city applications or government modernization, fraud tracking, public safety. There are a lot of different opportunities for IT investments. Some of them are PPP investments, but when you walk into the CIO's office of a government agency, these are the types of things where people are investing. So what I want to communicate today is that digital is really very complex. It is not just network. We're talking about an all-new way of governments to encourage digital infrastructure, digital investment, digital skills, and digital thinking. And first, they have to start with themselves, and that's not so easy for them to do. Some are getting there, but most are not. So when you think about government policy and digital future, it's pretty easy to look to Singapore or to Japan and Korea, these societies that are really with comprehensive plans for transition, but it's a big step down when you get into a low and middle income economy. So the final thought is that industry has a role to play because the governments need to be educated, and that doesn't mean just selling to them, right? They need to buy stuff, but to help create the digital awareness and to translate what this technology is and put it in human terms. Because ultimately, we're talking about human terms now. We're talking about societies changing cultures, changing economies, changing business practices, changing thinking. And when the tools are something as abstract as cloud, most people outside of this 1 kilometer where we are have no idea what cloud is. They will never care. So how do you help the senior leaders in a government wake up to what this is? And it's kind of, if we go back to the dream of PTC 30 or 40 years ago about basic telephony and getting things together, how can we create this new dream? So thank you, mahalo. It's great to be back.